All right. Well, all right. I've been reading Matthew McConaughey's memoir, and I haven't gotten up to Dazed and Confused yet. Someone in the comments section said, a pastor shouldn't know anything about Dazed and Confused. If that person had any idea what pastors know about people's lives. Rick was just telling me that the Bull Gravano is now on YouTube and, telling stories. And I'll tell you, you can get pastors on YouTube telling stories, but pastors have a have a bigger threat than mob retribution to be concerned about, and that's why we go to the grave with a lot of our stories. If you want to read some of my father's stories, my father did write a memoir after he retired, and it's called Chains of Grace by Stanley Van Clay. There's a little book promotion. It's on Kindle, and if you buy the book on Kindle, I think my mother gets a couple bucks. So, welcome today to the Bridges of Meaning Friday question and answer. I have to get this computer set up so I can keep an eye on the YouTube streams. I haven't quite figured out how to run everything here. Um, we have some new people in the room today. I was just talking to a woman from Brooklyn. Really made me all excited because I hear Brooklyn and Patterson in New York. It just um, makes me long for home and remember New Jersey and growing up there and everything. So let's see if I can watch this thing. So if there's last week, I gotta mute that. Okay, last week I gave $100 super chat, which was our first super chat. That was kind of cool. I'm not in it for the super chats, but that is turned on. So if you want to do that, I'll try and acknowledge that. Kind of doing a little bit of this and a little bit of that. How is everyone how are all the bridgers today in the chat room? Say hi, Valerie. Got it. Should hear your voice. There you are. How are you today, Valerie?
Doing all right. Plugging along, and I almost got here too late, so I was like, oh my goodness, it's almost 11 my time, so I'm like, oh, I need to jump on.
You're right on time. You're right on time. So now Rick and Joey want me to move along. They're worried about the backlog, and I think they're probably right. I should listen to them more.
Okay.
So I'll jump in and we'll start with the questions.
We just got everyone trained to be all quiet when you start streaming, and now you're asking us all to talk.
Well, some of you are a little less reluctant to talk than others, right, Luke?
Right, I'm busy right now, Paul.
I'll never get a chance to get Rick to say anything, but that'll just continue to promote the myth that Rick is just my cyber ego. So, all right, Brody, back from December 19. Okay, gotta keep these moving. Hi, Paul. In a recent article on Douglas Murray, Esther O'Reilly. Who's Esther O'Reilly? Esther O'Reilly said, and yet Murray fails to persuade the socially conservative reader that this train was designed with brake systems in the first place. He writes as if there is or was a moderate middle ground in this culture war. But what if it's been a zero-sum game all along? It makes me think that of others such as Helen Pluckrose, James Lindsay, now even Richard Dawkins, who are aghast that modernity and the Enlightenment values are not holding. What are your thoughts on this quote? I'm going to use a fancy Vervaeke term, opponent processing. I think in many ways, both things are often true. Is this current train going down the track going to make a mess? Yes, it will. And I think we saw some of that last week. We're going to continue to see some of that. I think Jonathan Peugeot is right that people think 2020 was bumpy. 2021 could be a lot bumpier, and it has been already. Will it go off the rails? That's what human beings do. We go off the rails. And then somehow, some way, things sort of get back on the rails and we keep playing the game. So I had a good conversation yesterday with Brett Sockold, who wrote that book Transubstantiation. He and I have spoken a number of times. I really like talking to Brett. I find in Brett a brother from another ecclesiastical mother in many ways. Uh, I think we just really click, and the conversation was a good one. I'll post it on Monday. But we're both moderates, and we're both optimistic moderates. And when I say an optimistic moderate, it's things are going to get bumpy, empires fall, people die. But part of the advantage of Christianity over a metaphysical system that doesn't afford a next stage or a next life is that messiness from this life can be accounted for and adjusted and worked through in a next stage. And even that thought impacts our view of what we do in this world. So yeah, and so Helen Pluckles and James Lindsay, although James Lindsay, it's been very interesting. And I hear this a lot increasingly from people who are in some ways supposed to be hardcore dyed in the wool atheists. They're getting less and less anti-Christian and more appreciative. It doesn't mean they necessarily believe this stuff, but more and more appreciative of what's going on in Christianity and why it has taken the form that it has. They see the utility of it, even if they don't buy the metaphysical claims of it. So, yeah. All right. Hey, one question done. That only took me a couple of minutes. Eddie Further Beyond. I'd like to see you and or John make a video on the eschaton. I feel like until that happens, you're never going to win over the new atheists. Um, we're never going to win over the new atheists. That's not how these things work. You might see movement between camps, but uh, people make their choices and they go to their grave, and these labels work to a degree and they don't work to other degrees. But the eschaton is, well, what I mean by the eschatology is the study of last things. It basically talks about, and I can phrase this in a lot of different ways, the end of the simulation or the apocalypse or the day of the Lord, or how many different ways. When you see the kinds of things we're seeing in Washington, D.C., it sort of reminds me of Matthew 13, the little apocalypse, where Jesus is strolling around Jerusalem with the apostles, and they're going ooh ah about the giant stones of the temple. And Jesus kind of shrugs and says, not one stone will be left on another. Like, when? And then he says a bunch of things, and preterists will say, well, those things kind of happen. But symbolic people will look at it and say, those things keep happening. And so it's that reason that, Jonathan Peugeot is in some ways sort of like a prophet arising at these days, and saying the kinds of things he does. That's the natural aspect of the ecosystem. So, I think I talk about the eschatology quite a bit. I have, at least lately. Is God actually real? And again, a sentence like that, the real operative words are, what do you mean by God and what do you mean by real? Is heaven actually real? What do you mean by heaven and what do you mean by real? Where do we go when we die? Who is we? What do you mean by go? Um, and there's some other questions that get into this. Can God really rain down fire and brimstone? Every time there's a volcano, we watch God really raining down fire and brimstone. Does it really matter if I watch porn or think certain thoughts? Of course it matters. How does it matter and why does it matter? This morning, before coming in here to the church, I was listening to Matthew McConaughey's Green Lights and enjoying it, and hearing about some of the um, adventures of his youth and the lessons he was learning. And the book is starting to grow on me. But there are consequences to all of these things. I released a video last night, Hard Lines and Grime Lines, and that's continuing to be in my head. a lot of my monologues are just what's in my head right now, and so you sort of get a window into at least part of my psyche with those videos. And if it weren't for the rough upbringing Matthew McConaughey had, there was one story about, remember the Johnny Cash song "One Piece at a Time," when the guy worked in a Cadillac factory, and so he steals his Cadillac one piece at a time and builds it. Matthew McConaughey has a story about how when he was a kid during a summer, um, he would get up in the middle of the night and one stick at a time steal from a lumber yard so he could build a massive tree house out in the woods. That's theft. Is that good for him? It's like, well, yeah, no. It's all of this stuff matters. C.S. Lewis has a great line in one of his books, it might be Mere Christianity, when he says, every time we do something, we either sort of turn towards or away from God. But as Brett Sockold and I talked about in the video that I'm going to release Monday, you know, the amazing thing about Christianity is that this God is not just, see, this is where we get to the hardline things. This God, when you read the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is more demanding. Jesus lays down a sexual ethic that we listen to and think, how on earth can I possibly stay on the right side of the line of that sexual ethic? And then there's a man like David, who's a man after God's own heart, who obviously comes nowhere near Jesus' sexual ethic. God has that kind of bandwidth and capacity, and this gets back into Jonathan Edwards. Um, these conflicting excellencies, I'll call them. It's sort of a theistic opponent processing that on one hand, God is enormously demanding that Moses, because he struck the rock instead of speaking to it the second time, sorry, no Canaan for you. But on the other hand, he's so outrageously generous that he sends his son to pay the price for sinners who, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So this is the story of the Bible. And we have a hard time keeping both these things in our mind, that God is so demanding that we think he's unreasonable, and he's so merciful that we think he's too lenient. And that's the picture of the Bible. And so when new atheists pop up and say, well, I just can't believe this Bible because there's inconsistencies, I look at them and say, you don't know the half of it. But isn't that you? And isn't that me? And so again, Matthew McConaughey's his grime lines in that story. He's, there's he and one of the things he got from his father. So there's a story about where Matthew McConaughey and a buddy stole a pizza, and he came home and he had gotten caught, and his father found out about it, and all his father wanted him to do was tell the truth. And Matthew McConaughey was too scared to tell the truth. And if he had just told the truth to his father would have, yeah, because his father had stolen lots of stuff, and his father was stealing pipe. There's a lot of stuff in there, and so on one hand, you can look at Matthew McConaughey's father and say, well, this is a man who, he would rob. He wouldn't rob. He would steal. Yet he has this high moral value that, well, if his son steals, that's not a good thing, but it's a forgivable thing. But lying, don't you dare lie to me, or I'm going to beat the crap out of you. Well, yeah, you shouldn't beat the crap out of your son either. So, but there's a sense in which, for Matthew McConaughey, some of the image of God is in his father, who, you just read the story, he's not a perfect man. But yet, even in the midst of that mess, there's an element of God that shines through it. What's that element of God? We'll confess our sins to him. Well, why is confession so important? Why is it so important that we come clean to God? So, part of what I've seen Christians do for a very long time is try to motivate individuals with Well, don't you want to go to heaven when you die? Well, yeah, but what if they don't believe in heaven? And what if they don't believe in hell? And I got into some of these things with my conversation with Sally. It's not going to be an effective line of argument. And I don't, a little bit later, maybe I'll manage not to bog down too much on one question or another. A little bit later, Zarlar asked, "Does God have a telos? If so, isn't that telos greater than God? God Himself is the telos. He's the be. That's how the beatific vision works. That finally, what God offers to this world is Himself. Why does He do that? Because He's the greatest thing. He's also absolute terror. And there's a way in which these things come together. One of the earliest pieces on my blog is from, I think, 2009, when I wrote a piece about hell, where in some strange way, if every description of heaven in the Bible, what do we mean by that word heaven? We mean union with Christ. So that heaven is, well, is it a place? Well, what is a place? Is it in time space like we are right now? Well, yeah, but do we access it? I mean, you get to a point in theology and physics and knowledge where things get really weird. And so now, I don't say that to undermine any of the stories. And this is where we sort of come full around by saying all of these stories and descriptions are true. Well, but you just said things get weird. Yeah. But this is where you get into C.S. Lewis's Miracles, his chapter on horrid red things. We can't talk about this weirdness without narrative and imagery and concrete representation. And the question is, well, does all of this concrete reality basically express that weird stuff that our minds are too simple to see? Well, yeah, that's kind of the point of it all. And well, how would you get that from Christianity? I don't know. Jesus is Son of Man and Son of God. Jesus is God. I mean, there's so much weirdness right in that assertion. And then we go to be with him and we live with him and we fall in love with Jesus. I mean, there's a sense in which the grime line and the campiness speaks truth that a lot of people who are playing at sophistication sort of miss. Yet you push this stuff hard enough and deep enough, and you begin to realize, oh yeah, it is very weird. Why does Jesus ascend? What is this? Why does he eat a fish? Why does he say, "This is my body"? I mean, why, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you can have no part of me. John 6. It's plenty weird. So to get back to the early premise here, James Lindsay on the Unsafe Christmas Party says, I've met Calvinists that basically say, you know, they can't convert people. I'm one of those Calvinists. It's not me who converts people. Now, God might use me in a process, but it's always God that moves us and shapes us. He's the author. We are the story. He is the sculptor. We are the clay. That's how this thing works. It's all well and good that we all understand this way of thinking, and if it makes us better people in our communities, even better. But unless it actually goes somewhere immaterial and then becomes material again, and that's the point of the crucifixion and the resurrection, that Jesus doesn't just, pass in and out of rooms, but he eats a fish, which means that, well, how does that happen? Because if he's a ghost, he can go in and out of a room, which is exactly why he says, show me some fish, I'll eat it. Because ghosts can't eat, because ghosts are in some ways less real than the walls and the door. And he says, I am more real than the walls and the door. And so I am more real than the fish. Well, what do you mean by real? Well, real is true at every level. It masters the physical level. It masters this, what do we mean by spirit? Spirit is the unseen that forms and shapes and moves the matter. And so when Jesus enters a room, he is master of the walls and the floor and the fish, and he is master of the world. Well, then why doesn't he go up in front of Caesar and Herod and Pilate and say, how do you like me now? Because why would he bother? Because the people that are front and center in his world are his friends. And you'd say, well, in terms of a status hierarchy, why would Peter be greater than Herod or Caesar or Pilate? But he is, because we're talking about Peter now. And most of the people listening to me can't even tell me which Caesar was in power when Jesus died and was risen again. The most important people in the world were in that room right there. And Jesus would continue to go on and colonize more. And, we have the Apostle Paul and on and on and on. So, I hope I'm not being too hard on Eddie Further Beyond, but the question, even the question of what is a Christian, this always sort of baffles us. And you know what? God decides. God knows. God picks and chooses. God decides who he wants to spend eternity with. And well, fortunately for us, he seems to be open to our ambitious chasings after him. And you see this again and again in the gospel. Someone will run up to him and say, Lord, heal my family member if you can. What do you mean if I can? It's like the guy's in utter panic because his child is sick. And Jesus, you know, it's not very nice of Jesus to say, "Oh yes, I'll heal her right away. I'm so sorry this is happening." Sounds like some customer service representative when you've had an uncomfortable flight on Delta. No, Jesus is not like that. Jesus is master of the world, and so he will write the story the way he wants to. And yeah, we'll have issues with him, but who are we? So that's the thing about, and I understand, Eddie, Further Beyond, um your anxiety and your desire, and in some ways that's a good desire, and I don't want you to lose that desire. I don't want you to lose that heat and desire that your lost friends and family could be included in the great story of God in a far better way. That's great. But some of these categories, they're part of the show. They're part of the program. It's not that it goes somewhere immaterial, it's that we understand that the immaterial governs the matter, that spirit governs flesh. That just like our hand, our mind moves our hand. So, yeah, it's a great question. Any comments on that from the Discord room? See, Luke must be busy. Luke always has a comment.
Okay, I'll jump in.
Yeah, there's Jacob. Jacob, before you say anything, I want you to meet, well, where is she? Shosh Jewel. She's from Brooklyn. So I met her before, so you two will have to meet and talk because that'll be fun. Anyway,
Hey,
go ahead.
Jacob. Shoshana here. I'll sign off.
Shoshana, we're gonna have to talk. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. I'm Shosh Jules. Thanks, Paul.
Yep.
So you spoke about the thing about Jesus setting the bar really high, and then David kind of bringing that down. I don't. This is one of the things where, like, it's like Christians don't seem to understand something that I think is very easily understood in Judaism, which is that God gives you lots and lots of opportunities, and there has to be enough work there for everyone to be challenged. Yet, being our Father, it's not a God doesn't need me to do anything, right? And the analogy I give in the text is you play chess with your father, he wins sometimes and he loses sometimes. He wins sometimes in order to make you work as hard as you can, and he loses sometimes because he what he really wants is for you to win every single time. And I think that's just a perfect analogy for what life in this world is, right? God gives you really high standards, and if you never fail, if you then obviously the standard wasn't high enough. And like it says, I believe in Proverbs, a tzaddik, a righteous person falls 7 times and gets up. And if your kid never skins his knees, then you're just not doing it right.
I agree. I agree. I agree, Jacob. Well said. So, and that's why the father metaphor is so good, and that's why, again, if you read Matthew McConaughey's Green Lights, his father is not a perfect man by any means, but there's something of our Father in heaven that that shines through Matthew McConaughey's father, and something of his creator is revealed through his father and all the messiness of him. So, no, I agree. I agree. Well said. All right. Leaf Whiz, Tor. Hi, Paul. I have a question I've been struggling with. When do you punch bullies? This kind of rolls into that. If you are a kid in school, should you punch the bullies? What does the Bible say about punching bullies? I think there is a time and a place to punch bullies, and wisdom is knowing the difference. And in the world is so amazingly complex, and I like Jacob's, the way Jacob just laid it out right there, because part of how this world is a great degree of freedom, and there are times and places to punch bullies, and there are times and places to not punch bullies, and part of the reason, and again, this area of the internet, Matthew McConaughey, Jordan Peterson, if schools now have a zero tolerance thing about bullying, and there's something appropriate to that, because bullying is cruel. I was bullied to a degree. I was pretty small when I was a freshman in high school, and there was kind of a bigger kid who was a lot bigger than me, but he couldn't run too fast, and then he had a little sidekick who could track me down and hold me until the big kid got there, and a lot of years later, just a few years ago, I made the comment about this. And then my mother learned that, I didn't know any of this stuff was happening. Of course, I wasn't going to tell my mother about this. I had a certain degree of pride. So there's a whole culture around that. And so schools right now um, are all hyper to cut out this culture. And to a certain degree, yes, that's right. But it has to be, this is where you get into, again, the Jonathan Peugeot stuff about, there has to be the fringes and the edges and the Jonathan Haidt stuff, where kids have to learn to work this stuff out themselves. They need a degree of unsupervised play. They have to get into a little bit of trouble. Now, the difficulty is that sometimes it will go too far and lives will be lost, or it's reality is just so enormously complex, and wisdom develops in time. So um yeah, there's a time and a place to punch bullies, and schools should be aware of bullying and try to do things about it. But how to get that exactly right, we never do. So we keep trying our best. So it's a good question. All right. Richard, Zurich, 04. Hope you're doing well, Paul. I am. I've been wading through Peugeot land lately and have a similar question to Eddie Soupspoon. I was discussing the Christian sexual ethic with an atheist who advocates the consent-only culture you've critiqued, and found it difficult to do so. Yeah, it's not gonna work. I said to him I wanted to do. It's not only not going to work, it's not even true. It's you think that through long enough, and you see, no, no, it's not consent only. Um, okay, I'll stop interrupting myself. I'll try to stop interrupting myself. I said to him I wanted to do more research on that topic, but I actually experienced some hesitation because of the Peugeot I've been watching. Should Christians attempt to rationally justify things like our sexual ethic in worldly terms, well-being, educational outcomes, etc., especially when one of the most important aspects of Christian emphasis on marital union is to be in line with the pattern of Christ uniting with the church? I've been moving away more and more from evolutionary and scientific explanations for Christian practices in favor of symbolic biblical understanding, and feel like I'd been missing the point or something if tried to justify them rationally. Thoughts? That's a good question. it's sort of the difference between Tim Keller has this great illustration where he tells his son to do so, and his son is, I think, probably a tweener or something. His son says, "Why?" And Tim Keller says to his son, "If I tell you why I want you to do this, then you're doing it because you think so, but I want you to do this because I want you to trust me." I think both of those realities are good and right and true. And just like with the bullying question, there are times to punch a bully in the nose, and there are times to not. And schools should worry about bullying and do what they can about it, but schools shouldn't do it in a way that makes it tyrannical. And so there are times in our life when we have to resist reason and be obedient. And there are times in our life when understanding the shape of obedience with rationality is helpful to people. A lot of preaching is sort of giving explanations that help people be obedient. But sometimes you just need obedience. And that's kind of the hard line and the grime line. And so I'm convinced that part of what goes into a lot of these challenges for us is that consciousness is monofocal. We can really only see, no, it's the exaptation of our visual mechanisms. We can only really see very clearly one thing at a time in terms of our consciousness. And so when we focus on obedience, we can say, oh, yeah, obedience is important. And it is. But then we can sometimes look at obedience, blind obedience, and say, oh, well, that was just, look at look at politics right now, whatever side you're on. You've got two sides who are sort of blind obedient to a certain propagandist zeitgeist, and people are out there yelling they should think. And again, I talk to part of the reason I try to not I try to post things on my channel as soon as I can is because I want to talk about my conversation with Brett Sockold without having all of you roll your eyes, because I was there and you weren't there, and you will be there Monday. But so uh, again, I think about Vervaeke's opponent processing. And in terms of our lives, obedience and understanding sort of lean against each other. When you're a child, your mom says, "Don't touch the stove." You say, "Why?" "Because I said so." Because to a certain degree, any explanation she gives about the potential harm of burning your hand and maybe permanently deforming it is unintelligible to a 5-year-old. And that's why, because I said so, is the best answer. But there will be some kids that touch that stove and they will learn a lesson. And now, well, rationality. Okay, how far can rationality go? I'll say, okay, it hurts. All right, well, is that terribly rational? Well, there's these nerve endings in your hand, and the synapses fire to the brain, and they do this, and because evolutionarily, yada 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 yada. It hurts. Well, it hurts is pretty good too. And it hurts is probably more salient. So I'm not only reading the Matthew McConaughey Green Lights, I started reading uh, Stephen King's On Writing, which I'm really enjoying. And he tells this story about when he was a kid, he had strep throat and he had a terrible ear infection. And so his mother would take him to the doctor, and they would puncture and drain his ear. And as he writes about that, he writes it very well. Obviously, he's Stephen King. And so the doctor lays him down and puts a pad down, and it's happened once before, and the doctor's coming at him with this needle, and the doctor says it won't hurt a bit. And he sort of believes him again. Why? And what the doctor, of course, lied to him, because it's going to hurt terribly. But the doctor lies to him, and he sort of believes him again, so that actually the medical treatment can be effective on him. And so this is the kind of world we're living in. So I would say because we're conscious creatures and we have to take things episodically, one thing at a time, there'll be seasons in your life when you just learn the discipline of submission and obedience. And you say, you know what? I've got all kinds of good reasons to not be obedient. But for now, I'm just going to say, this is what God wants. I will submit. It's sort of like Mary when she hears about, okay, you're going to become pregnant. This is, you know, I'm God's tool. I'm going to be obedient. Let him use me. And then there'll be times in your life when it's going to be rationality and you're going to think things through. The thing is, if we didn't have both, we couldn't live. So consciousness makes us. So lately we've talked about a lot of dualities. Is it one thing or is it many things? Is it one thing or is it two things? Well, sometimes it's one thing and it's two things, but we can only see one thing at a time. And so that creates dualities. Dualities is just this and not this. So it's kind of two things that are one thing. Again, this stuff gets really weird when you penetrate it. But yes, when it comes to, so again, I was reading McConaughey's book, and compared to Matthew McConaughey, I was a much more obedient child in many ways. Not perfectly obedient, but much more obedient. So I read his book and I think about my life and think, what did my obedience get me? And I think that thing through and I find my obedience got me some good things. Um, Maybe I didn't have some of these other experiences. Maybe I'd be wiser if I did. But one of the things I recognize too is that, so I pastor a church, and in my church, there are people who have been lifelong, obedient, faithful Christians. And there are other people who have had long and complex and messy and grimy lives before they came to Christ. And when they came to Christ and they learned a degree of obedience, their lives settled down and they had a lot more order. And and so when I talk to those people, a lot of times people who had sheltered, obedient, ordered lives growing up look at the other side and say, "Oh, my story's so boring compared to yours." And a lot of times the people on the other side look at them and say, "I wish my story was more boring." Each of us wants, so, I do a lot of conversations often with younger people younger than myself on this channel. And often I realize that some of the people who have had great parents and loving lives and have been obedient, when they come on the channel, tell me about your life. There aren't a lot of grimy stories that grab our interest because they haven't done much, because they've been good people living ordered lives. And every parent wants this for their kid in many ways. I don't want my kid to suffer. I don't want my kid to get in trouble. I don't want my kid to do all kinds of things before it's time to have all kinds of complexity later in life when it's going to complicate their lives. That's what every good parent wants. But at the same time, all the best stories come from, Stephen King was raised by a single mother who really struggled with a lot of things. And so Stephen King and his brother really struggled. Matthew McConaughey, his parents divorced twice and married three times each other. And I've known couples like this. They get married, they fall in love, and then, gosh, they can't stand each other. They get a divorce, and then maybe they marry someone else in the middle. That doesn't work out. So they go back to number one. I mean, and well, maybe if they were more obedient, they could have weathered that and had less weddings and divorces, and the lawyers and the preachers would have made a little less money. I- life lays itself out in strange ways. So I think it's a good question, Richard. And maybe you're in a season of life now where you're going to work on obedience, and you'll discover that obedience is hard. But look at the monks. What do monks learn in monasteries? They learn that obedience is hard, but obedience is also fruitful. And as Jacob's little speech that he just gave us, sometimes disobedience is fruitful too, if we can learn from it and grow in wisdom. So it's a good question. Any comments from the Discord room, from the voice chat?
I guess I want to make this comment really quick. I think that wisdom wisdom says that you never punch a bully. You take their back and do a rear naked choke.
Yeah, Anthony's yeah, you'll have to meet Anthony. Anthony's often in the open studio, and he's waiting for that big fight. He's waiting for that big fight. So we'll wait with Anthony for that. All right, Jason S. Almond Tree or Almond Tree in the thriving metropolis of Ripon, California. I just had a long discussion this morning with my younger sister about time and space. We began our conversation about how abstract thought needs to meet the material realm, and mankind is the conduit between these two things. Somehow, this led into time and space. So I was wondering if there might be some link or parallel between time and abstract thought and space and the material world. It's an interesting question. Is time more heavenly and space more earthly? Is time masculine and space feminine? Maybe that's a dumb question. I don't think it's a dumb question. I'm just trying to understand all these things and piece them together. They seem important. Well, these are fun questions. And the medieval C.S. Lewis, so when I first met Byrne Power, he said, my favorite book of C.S. Lewis is The Discarded Image. And that was one of the C.S. Lewis books I hadn't read. And he says, few people have read it. And it's true. There's no audiobook of The Discarded Image. And so then I read The Discarded Image. And it's a really cool book because it contrasts. Lewis basically explores the classical and medieval thought and that lost world, the geocentric universe. Now, there are ways in which that model doesn't work for us, but there are ways in which that model continues to reveal a degree of truth. Just recently with the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter and now Mercury, everyone gets all excited. Why? Because the heavens seem to be declaring and validating the story of Christ. Okay. So I think those are good questions, and I don't really have any good answers for them, Jason, but I'd encourage you to keep thinking about them and keep asking them and see if you can get Peugeot to take a crack at it. I was looking at his December question and answer video, and his answers are a lot shorter than mine. I should aspire to that kind of greatness. So that's a good question. See, Rick and Joey, how quick I'm moving through these. I'm only 45 minutes in, and I've gotten through more than one question. So, okay. PVK, is Christ going to return? Yes. And be pleased about our not celebrating the Lord's Supper as brothers, sisters in his church universal. Will he be pleased about us not celebrating the Lord's Supper as brothers and sisters of a church universal? No. Will he be pleased we withheld this joint celebration because we weren't in tradition X or believe in dogma Y? No. He does not like our disunity. But now I'm going to make it more, my Sunday school class often complains that I take the Bible and I muddy the waters. Well, what kind of unity is he looking for? So the Roman Catholic Church has a high degree of structural unity, and there's some good things about that, but there's some complexity about that too. And evangelicalism is sort of an attempt to create another kind of unity across structures. So it's very interesting that you can look at the New Testament, let's say, and now I expose my Protestant self. You look at the New Testament and what kind of unity did they have there? A close reading of the New Testament reveals, boy, there's a lot of fighting going on. And even that little window we have into the very early church from the New Testament is obviously enormously incomplete, because I think, again, a close reading of it suggests that, with Luke and Paul, we sort of track Paul running around, but those Greek named deacons, named in Acts 6 start roaming around, and we hear some of their stories. And then we've got other people roaming around, like, for example, the author of the book of Hebrews. And who is that author? We don't know. And you just get the sense of this very live context, which is enormously messy. And, Paul is so upset at the Corinthian church. I was just reading a book, suggesting that maybe the Corinthian church that Paul's writing to maybe is a church of 50 people. And so, the size of the mega church named Living Stones in Sacramento. Um, uh, it's and this sort of gets back to Richard's question about obedience and rationality. Yeah, we're all a mess. But and then to get sort of to Jacob's um offering in this question and answer, God understands our mess, and he's going to use the mess to get there, to get us there. Get us where? Well, wherever he's getting us to go. So yeah, and I the bridges of meaning discord, where a lot of people are excited about orthodoxy. My conversation with Sally, we're working stuff out. That, again, like I said, when I talk to Brett Sockold often, I feel like he's a brother from another ecclesiastical mother. And so often he'll say things and I think, boy, I think that's right too. And part of me hopes that maybe whatever I contribute, for whatever becomes of this little contribution that I'm making via YouTube and the Discord, that somehow we move to resolve the protest that is Protestantism, and to see the division between Rome and the patriarchs, to see that healed, and to have us all move towards the unity of Christ. Um, so Yeah, I want to see. I should read the rest of your question. Lest 1 Corinthians 11, 17 through 30, 34 be used as justification, we should remember that it was time specific and already diverges from Christ's entreaty. And I assume you're talking about the Gospel of John. Care should be taken to read this in the context of time and space. Yes. While I understand how instantiation of doctrine can act as a bulwark against corruption or data loss, my overarching concern becomes doctrine over persons. At what point does insularity and exclusivity become a counter narrative to love and its universal expression? Yeah, all of our lives now we're sort of having Aristotle Socrates issue here, or Aristotle Plato issue here. Is it sort of the vision, the emanation vision of Plato, or is it sort of the ground up instantiation of Aristotle? So we've got that in here. It's the one and the many. We bump into that. I seek to colonize the definition of dialogos. My new definition would be communication between two or more nodes on the Christ net, even nodes unaware they are indeed on the network. What do you say, man of the beard? I think I just said it. The beard's growing longer. I'm getting to the oh no phase, and I'm tempted to shave it off. So we'll see how long the beard lasts, or if I decide to, you know, try to groom a bit. I mean, part of the reason you have the evolution of the beard, as my daughter so lovingly illustrated, is that yeah, I get tired of it. You see, starts growing way down here. It just keeps getting bigger. My cousin, who I assume has facial hair like mine, his beard gets way out here. So, do I want to do that? I don't know. Anyway, bro, Tiffy. Hi, PVK. I've been wondering, do you think that the Bible supports the idea of a soul as something separate from the body? Okay. Is my story separate from the body? In some ways, my soul. So in the Mary Cohen, John Vervaeke, I'm going to have Mark on the channel next week. This question about story and narrative, is the story the thing we can't get at, and is the narrative our telling at it? I mean, the soul, us and the soul, has that kind of problem to it. You don't, our soul isn't Our soul isn't a material thing, or I should say, our soul isn't a physical thing. And our cell, and that's why, I tell this story before. I visit my grandma when she's pushing 90, and I'm a college kid. And she looks at me one day and she says, when I think about myself, I think about myself at your age. But when I look in the mirror, I wonder, where did that old lady come from? Well, what's the union between what's the timeless, everlasting aspect of my grandmother? Well, that's her soul. That's her story. But that wasn't purely contained by her, because bits of her were seen by others. My view of my grandmother probably held a sliver of truth unique to our interaction that my grandmother couldn't see. And that certainly was true of her husband and her children. So, and the only possible perfect, complete view of my grandmother would have to be held by God. And in that sense, and Jesus gets at this when he notes that when they talked about Abraham and the patriarchs, they didn't use the past tense. And Jesus says, that's because Abraham and the patriarchs are still alive in God. But there's a sense in which Abraham and the patriarchs are are reduced by even God's knowledge of them until God reinstantiates them in the resurrection. And if you understand the logic of, now when I say mythology, I don't mean that disparagingly or less real, but rather more real, but rather the way that these stories are told and embodied. If you understand that reality, you can begin to see how philosophically mature and deep and profound the Bible is, because the Bible not only contains that kind of thought, but articulates it in stories and ways that even children can get. So, yeah, the soul is you, and you have a sense of yourself, but your parents have another view of yourself. Your children have a view of yourself. Your friends have a view of yourself. And because of all your biases and because of your limitations of time and space, you can't see it all. So, from what possible vantage point could actually the totality of you, that would be your soul, be known? Well, that would only be God, because it would have to include all the way back to your ancestors and the decisions made by parents and grandparents that made into you becoming the you that you are, all the way down to the biochemical phase. So that is what your soul is. But it's again analogous to a story, but it's far deeper and richer than any story any of us would ever have time to tell. So Jews believe in the ruach, or breath, as it relates to the origins of life of God. Yeah. But does that necessarily correlate to the Platonic idea of an individual immortal soul? Now, I am a Christian, and I don't believe our souls are immortal. Our souls have beginnings. Now, in some ways, if we imagine our soul to be a story, they begin long before we're actually conceived, but they are not eternal. They are everlasting. And I think that's unlike theological systems such as, my friend Daniel is a Mormon. And so he always tells me that, well, children choose their parents, because Mormons have this entire mythology about pre-existing souls. And I don't subscribe to that. I think we are not eternal. We are instead everlasting. And well, why are we everlasting? Because we are known by God. Now, again, if you're a naturalist or a materialist, then all of this all of this stuff that we most care about is just fluff. It's just sort of the mental the mental it's just information that is passing away and will die. And that's why the entire shape of the Christian story is about life and not death, because your story doesn't die the way your body does. Well, how can we think about that and talk about that and bear witness to that? Christianity bears witness to that. So I think that Christ's life is eternal. Yes, and that is he is Christ is divine, and that's what we mean by that. He is pre-existent. He has no beginning, no end. He's eternal. He's outside of time. And that's, I think, part of the reason why the church fathers and the early church councils made the decisions that they did. But he is also human. So there's and again, all of this machinery around Christology and Trinitarian logic gets into those kinds of ideas. And the theology and the narrative all go to try to embody these ideals. And again, the assertion of the religion is that all this is true. That's the way these systems work. So any comments from the voice chat on that? Nope. All right. Where am I? Oh, Kalepa. All right. I often get questions about some of the process. YouTube is full of information about how to make YouTube videos. Currently, I am using a Sony A6400 camera, and Rick and I have been going back and forth over how exactly I should make my videos. Rick doesn't like the mic in the picture. I don't mind it in the picture. So I've been monkeying around with this. I use a Blue Yeti mic. For my monologue videos, use OBS right now. For most of my conversations, I just use the Zoom recording. I told David Fuller that from Rebel Wisdom, and he gasped. He says, "You just use the recording?" It's like, yeah, it's simple. It works. Yeah, the quality's not there. Yeah, there's a bunch of issues with it, but that's what I use. So I used to use Screen Record-O-Matic. That I started out with that. There were sound issues, and then I was using Bandicam and Bandicut. I still use Bandicut as a really quick and easy video cutting and editing software. It's super fast and it's super easy, but you can't do much with it. That's why it's fast and easy. But OBS has been helping me maybe do a little bit better on my sound levels. So that's what I use. All right. Little word to the wise with questions about video clips. I usually don't look through these questions and answers before Friday morning. So if you recommend a video for me to watch, I probably haven't watched it. Yes, David Bentley Hart is a prominent theologian. Refers to Jordan Peterson condescendingly. I told Rick, David Bentley Hart is obviously a big deal, and he's very popular on this Discord server. He's David Bentley Hart. When he wrote I did in fact look at this little video. They talked about his New Testament. You can Google N.T. Wright's take on David Bentley Hart's New Testament. N.T. Wright is also a very prominent scholar, and N.T. Wright didn't particularly like David Bentley Hart's translation of the New Testament. So David Bentley Hart is David Bentley Hart. And yeah, I haven't taken a deep dive into him. He's an astoundingly good writer. He seems to be willing to go on small YouTube channels, but before, at some point, what I watch and what I read and when I watch it and when I read it is really very dependent on what's interesting me now, or if, I'm increasingly now I'm getting requests to um, I'm getting requests to read and review and have conversations with authors on my channel. I'm going to have to figure out what I'm going to do with that. There's some books that I very much do want to read. I just found out again from Brett Sockel that I didn't know how I got his book. Apparently, was it his mother? His mother had started watching my channel and thought, "Ooh, he should talk to Brett." And so she contacted Brett and said, "Tell the publisher to send him a book." And so I got a book kind of in the mail, and I put it off for a long time because I don't know if I want to wade into the whole thing. But then when I read it, I was very excited because it was very germane. And so then Brett and I really hit it off. People are complex, and part of how you can create a big YouTube channel, for those of you who want to create a big YouTube channel, the situation is fairly simple. Get bigger names and do conversations and interviews with big names, because if someone has a big name and they're high in status, people will come and watch you on YouTube. That's an absolutely fine way to grow a channel. That's not really what I'm about. I am more interested in seeing what kind of community we can knit together, and not necessarily to see how fast it can grow, but how durable the knitting can be and how productive the interactions between you all can be. So that's more my goal. And so when Sally says to me, the Bridges of Meaning Discord server seems to be a little bit more durable. Discord servers sort of flower and wither like Jonah's vine, and she says, well, that's partly your influence. And I think it is partly my influence. And it's because I'm a pastor, and it's because I, I dipped on last night, and a bunch of people were there playing a game and looking at a funny video and having a good time. I love that. I love that. I want to see friendships made via this Discord server. I want to see men and women find each other and fall in love and have children. I want to see people work on tough things in their life, and they might not resolve them, but they might find friends along the way that can support them and help them get through. So, yeah, I'm a small church pastor, and maybe I'm, founding a small church Discord, but that's okay, because one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about lately is, what do people need? We're not hatched on, you know, we're not hatched on some river floor in Northern California and have some salmon spawn us. We are raised in tiny little grouplets called families, where we have a mother and a father, and we have brothers and sisters. And I was listening to Mary and Karen, their conversation, and where, we have cousins who are sort of like siblings, but there's no sibling rivalry. And so cousins are special, and we scale out from there. So if we create a small YouTube channel with again, small, people say, oh, it's 16,000, that's not small. Yeah. All these things have their own scales. But if we have a place where people can come and make friends, there's lots of answers out there. And this is, again, sort of gets where the soul and the body come together. There's lots of answers out there. But just recently in the open studio, Cassidy and Shane and Andrea were all in one window together. And it's like, what? They don't all live in the same place. And so Andrea was in Arizona visiting family, and Shane drove down from California, and they met up with Cassidy. And that kind of thing just delights me, because what it means is that there are friendships that are blooming and growing, and these kinds of friendships are the kinds of things that shape us and give life to us. So yeah, the talk and the ideas, they're all good, but they're all in service to an end, which is heaven and earth. And it's not only the friendship and the fellowship today, but in Christianity, that then goes from this age into the next and is everlasting. So, all right, future Zeus. Future Zeus. You reference C.S. Lewis's miracles routinely. Yes, I do. But I don't know what you actually got from that book. Good question. When I read miracles, it struck me as some rehashed Lewisian ideas and an uncompelling argument that reason itself is a miracle. Yeah, that's true. It's obviously affected you deeply. True. Can you explain what you have gotten from that book besides an apologetic argument that reason is a miracle? The kind of apologetics that Lewis might have said made his faith feel weaker. And that's how I feel reading it. Well, then stop. I started reading that book routinely when, Sally, spoke compellingly about her doubt. I started reading that book routinely when I was really struggling with the kinds of doubts and really in some ways I'd say a meaning crisis. When, well, what if everything we care about is just the imaginary cruft of meaningless physical beings running through time? There's a meaning crisis. And when I'd read Lewis prompted questions that helped me. And again, so I was listening to Julian talk to Nathan. I had Nathan on the channel. Nathan, Digital Gnosis. He became a Christian with Jordan Peterson, started going to a church, had some conflict with a assistant pastor who was giving him, let's say, direct instruction, and he wasn't having it. And so he's, sort of became an agnostic, and he's, interested in philosophy, kind of bored with doing computer stuff. And so he was having a conversation with Julian. Of course, Julian is well known around here too. I remember my first conversation with Julian was such a delight. It's like, look at this. There's a Hutterite out there who listens to philosophy while he welds dumpsters, and he loves Kierkegaard, and he thinks deeply about his Christianity, and he lives in community. And that's such a joy to find Julian. And then to have Julian and Nate talk I just found that conversation so compelling. But when you listen to Nate again and again and again, and it comes down to this hard question of, well, how do we reconcile the Bible and history? And this has been a really tough thing that the church has struggled with for the last couple of 100 years. And it prompted the modernist fundamentalist. It prompted some of the hard stuff that Darwin would present. And both of the answers that the modernist fundamentalist fight produced has complicated the faith development of the church. And these questions have to be dealt with. And so while you're right, Lewis does deal with reason and the miraculous. And I still find Lewis's point that what we consider natural and what we consider reason do very much, there's some opponent processing within that relationship too. And so, but what really grabbed me was, again, and this I've been really reflecting a lot on his chapter on horrid red things, because What's the relationship between the story and the thing that the story is pointing to? Because if you're a materialist, especially now that, the old atheist answer to reason was, well, we develop reason because it helps us succeed in the world. And then Donald Hoffman comes along and says, nah, actually it doesn't really. It's all the tricks and hacks that help us survive and succeed in the world. And C.S. Lewis pointed that out. Alvin Plantinga pointed that out. And so then the question is, well, does reason actually point to something more real than the world? Well, and this gets into the Vervaeke Mary Cohen back and forth. Is there what is the thing behind the story? Is that just sort of an articulation of events? Or is there meaning? And is meaning more than just an experience that we have or something that's in the human intersubjective? Is meaning in fact why we were made? And again, I got into some of this stuff with Brett Sockold. So I, you know, your mileage may vary is always the case for any kind of book recommendation. And the fact that people find Lewis's book unconvincing does not surprise me. And to some degree or another, Lewis found it unconvincing because he stopped writing that form of apologetics and started writing story. Now he wrote the Narnia Chronicles, and I think his writing the Narnia Chronicles was in continuation with his apologetic work. And then he wrote Till We Have Faces, which is his best novel, but from some accounts, his best novel was sort of half written by Joy Davidman. And so Lewis wasn't a great fiction writer. He just wasn't. Not like Tolkien, and Tolkien couldn't stand Narnia. Now, if Ward is right and Lewis was just being his nerdy, weird old self riffing on medieval and classical mythology via the Chronicles of Narnia in a children's book, that's totally believable that the Narnia Chronicles follow the 7 planets and what those meant in the medieval period. That's totally Lewis. So yeah, I'm not at all upset or bothered by the fact that you don't like miracles. Your mileage may vary. I find it to be a deeply helpful book, and it has helped me find a way to wrestle with this stuff. Now, again, and I mean, I say what I'm about to say, a lot of people are going to jump in and try and make me feel better. And I'm going to tell you, I don't feel bad at all about what I'm about to say. I am a pastor. I'm not an academic. I am not a historian. Um, I am, I have my own assessment as to my own level of intelligence and my own capacity for processing things, and all of that is limited. And I'm totally good with my limitations. I see people who are way smarter than myself, and I watch them tortured uh, because of the difficulties and complexities in the world, and it's like I'll be a little dumber and a little happier. I'm not. I'm a-okay with that trade-off. And so if I regularly talk to people that are way smarter than myself, and I have learned sometimes I should just sit back and keep my mouth shut because brilliance is being produced, and I don't want to get in the way or muddy the waters. And again, some people are going to say, "Oh, Paul, blah 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 blah, you do blah blah blah," and that's true too. Anybody who knows me personally knows I have a really robust ego that is not easily um, depressed. So I don't feel bad about my limitations or the poverty of what I can produce. I'm just happy that I'm just happy to be helpful for people that they can find joy in life. So that's how am I doing with oh gosh, I'm not catching and they keep coming. They keep adding more questions. Okay, I got to keep moving. Richard with another question. First video I watched of you was your first Rebel Wisdom interview, and you referred to Jordan Peterson as a type of an unauthorized exorcist. Yes, I found this was a helpful description, but for some reason, something clicked in your interview with Brett Anderson. Did Peterson cast a demon out of Brett? Is this a miracle like the placebo effect? Question. This Think about everything that I've been working on in terms of trying to understand what we mean by this crazy word spirit. Jordan Peterson is an exorcist. Exorcists cast out spirits. Jordan Peterson, in his work, was casting out spirits from our culture. Why do people hate him? Because, well, look at the story of Legion. Jesus tells that spirit, time to go. And don't send us into the abyss. What's the abyss? Forgottenness? The torments of hell? Don't send us into the abyss. All right, go into those pigs. Now, symbolically, when you think about that story, there's a reason that story doesn't leave us alone. And yeah, did Jordan cast out a demon out of Brett? He absolutely did. The meaning crisis is a demon. Okay. And I was talking to someone that was dealing with some stuff, and he, like many people I talk to, kind of interested in Jordan Peterson, but in terms of having in terms of embracing a mental ontology of God's existence and Jesus' resurrection and miracles. They're way too modernist for that. And at this point in time, they're not ready to go to church and say, I believe. But there are little lying spirits in their souls that are whispering things to them every night. And if I say that symbolically or say it on TV in terms of a movie or something like that, we seem to be able to take it. But when we bring it into the real world, and what we mean by that is some imagination of the physical world, then we start coughing, and well, there's a spirit there too. What do I mean by a spirit? Well, watch all my videos where I talk about spirits, because and this does connect in with miracles, because I want to have us have a better understanding of what we mean when we use that word, because I find I find people who are the biggest atheists around throwing it about like there's nothing inconsistent about its use. And I look at that and I say, hogwash. You're saying that all of this story and all of this mythology is just cruft. But then you go and use that word. That's when Peterson is dead on right that no, you're not an atheist. That people are all offended. Peterson is an exorcist. He's been casting demons out of people. He's got his own spirits that he's wrestling with. That's quite obvious, but that's what he's done. If you understand what a spirit is and why we are spiritual. And again, I don't think I'm done thinking about that or have settled on things, but I think I've got a far better understanding that both seems to match with our current contemporary usage of the word and the biblical usage of the word. So that's what I'm working on. Jason again. I've been hearing a lot about the unity between chaos and raw potentiality and order, the unity of heaven and earth. A friend of mine was talking to me about New York's New Year's Eve. Luckily, I recorded the conversation and was able to listen back over it, and I think some more. We talked about how there seems to be a third element that might not be mentioned. He brought up the song of Schoolhouse Rock. 3 is a magic number. I'll have to look that up. My thought is that in the unity of chaos and order, heaven and earth, there is also God. Genesis 1:1. God created heaven and earth. I mentioned here that the 3 colors of the veils of the temple, red, purple, blue, heaven would be blue, earth red, and God or the king would be purple. Do you think that's correct? I think it's working symbolically. How do you think that the purple or the third element could be the fear of God or the king? And then he goes on from there. Yeah, I think you're thinking productively, and this is, as with many things, the potential of symbolism is almost always its liability. And we've John Vervaeke is wrestling with that in some ways with Mary Cohen, because the power of symbolism is that it can map all kinds of things. The power of science is that you remove things and get very specific. And that again is why the personal is the powerful. And that again is why we are the breath of God and the stuff of earth. And why all of these things come together, and why oneness is such a powerful thing that it keeps coming up and people can't leave it alone. And dualities are powerful things. Why, it's one or the other, it's one or the other, it's back and forth. And why when three comes along, well, now we're sort of reaching the edge of what our consciousness can bear. So, and if I say it that way, it almost sounds like a reduction. And some may, in fact, reduce it, say, oh, three is only powerful because consciousness is monofocal. And that then leads to dualities where we sort of quickly time shift between one or the other. And then three just blows our mind. Well, of course, God is three in one. So you can reduce it to that kind of um, consciousness, psychological logic as well. So, yeah, that's out there. But I think you're doing productive thinking. Nine-digit Eric. Why, oh, why, in that conversation with Vervaeke and Mary, was authorship not mentioned? Because every conversation has a life of its own. But yeah, you're right. It's authorship is a metaphor that is a very powerful one, and that's part of the reason why I often use it. Tolkien is the author of Middle Earth. Is Tolkien in Middle Earth? Now we're sort of, this is sort of parabolic knowledge, sort of like Mary's daddy is the knife, mommy is the fork, and baby is the spoon. And now Mary has just done a video with Mark and Manuel that digs into that. Now that all gets pretty esoteric. All right, I have to any comments from the voice chat on any of this stuff right now that I've prompted in you? All right, I'm going to keep going. Maybe, well, let's see. So Shosh Jules had hers that she, maybe if I can get down to there today, I won't be so backlogged. Pastor Vanderclay, you said we can only understand each other through projecting ourselves onto others. Do you think that C.S. Lewis projected himself onto God in miracles and by fashioning God into the likeness of a lion in the Chronicles of Narnia? Yeah, I think that's how we process things. We go back and forth, and that's always risky because it's idolatrous, but we don't just avoid idolatry mentally, we also avoid idolatry physically. And that's part of the reason for the church, that if we act these things out in the church, it affords us the ability to think thoughts that maybe we couldn't think unless we have the kind of discipline and obedience that I was talking to Richard about before. So actually um, Jesus is the lion in Narnia. I mean, that's Jesus is Aslan. Well, Aslan is God. Well, and in all fairness to our brother Sam in the Discord, really, it's really the reason that I'm really glad Sam is here in the Discord. I mean, we can sort of sit on our laurels on the church councils and say, "Up, it's all set, 3 in 1, 1 in 3, and two natures of Christ." But that doesn't mean theology ends. That does become a framework, and um, I and one of the things that Sam does in our presence is, because he knows so much. I mean, it's I'm not going to sit down for a debate with Sam on the Trinity. He's read too much. I'm going to throw Nathan Jacobs and Brett Sockled at Sam because that'll be a much fairer fight. They say, well, you're a pastor and Sam isn't. Yeah, but these titles and these educations and these things that we have, they only tell the beginning. Those are only rough references. You can find lay people out there that know way more than pastors. And you can find lay people out there that will know way more than scholars, because knowledge is a very, very complex thing. So part of the blessing of having Sam here is that he pushes us. Okay, you lazy Trinitarians, you know, put up or shut up. And, I'm glad Sam lives in Chicago, because if you lived in Sacramento, I'd have to do a whole lot more reading on church fathers. So, this is, I think, how God loves us with each other and brings people into our lives that help us grow. Mark, Paul, I loved your talk with John Vervaeke and Mary Cohen, but you didn't really interject as much as I would have liked. Well, I was enjoying it. I liked listening to them, and a growing edge of mine is to not interrupt so much, because it's a problem sometimes. To that end, I would love to hear your thoughts on what narrative is and why it's important. Yeah, Mark and I are going to talk. I see narrative as a thing you submit to in exchange for not having to make too many combinatorial explosive choices. Oh, that's really good. Maybe since you have to outsource your cognition, and Mark knows a lot about this, and he's been in the open studio too quite a bit. And I'm looking forward to having Mark on the channel and exposing him to a little bigger platform. He's obviously done a lot of work in this, as has Manuel, as have the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord server. So this is why we're doing this stuff. And to have Mark, and Manuel sort of challenge Vervaeke, and that speaks of John's quality, because in academia, a lot of people would say, I'm not going to talk to you unless you have a PhD behind your name. But you notice John doesn't do that. And he treats people with respect, and he's open, and he entertains ideas. But he's also he's also a scholar, and he's also a human being. So, I to have an opportunity to work on this kind of stuff like we're doing outside of the university, this is wonderful. And to be a pastor in this, and to sort of put a church valence over all of this, and to have this be part of people's discovery of faith, this is a dream come true. I've always wanted the church to be something like this, because there's lots of different people with lots of different temperaments, and what it takes to find faith, and to have that faith become fully formed in oneself, both in terms of obedience and rationality. That's a rare gift, and we're enjoying it now. So, enjoy it while it lasts, because it won't last forever. Nothing ever does. It's the age of decay, baby. Maybe since you have to outsource your cognition, these narratives are the way that we do it. I think that's a good point too. If we don't do that carefully, narratives will be provided for us. It's absolutely true. And narratives, this is where, okay, so let's join narrative and spirit. In some ways, spirits are sort of like narratives, or if we're saying story is the thing that narratives try to get at, then in some ways spirits are stories, but they're very agentic stories, and they're very communal stories, and they are outsourced, and they are sort of like ideas. We're using these different words to try to get at the things behind them, which our words are only models and approximations of. And so, that's why this is a really helpful comment. How do you feel about this construction? I think it sounds productive, and I'm intrigued by it. What is your idea of narrative versus story? I don't know, but we'll probably keep talking about it and making progress in it. That's part of why someone left a comment that Stephen King, in his book on writing, gets into the question of what is a narrative. Now, I'm still in the biographical section of that book. I'm still early on in the book. I'm really enjoying it. Stephen King is, one of the most successful authors of our time, and his I'm really tempted to subscribe to CBS Interactive, but it's like, part of me is like, how many of these little channels am I going to subscribe to? Because they're doing a new adaptation of The Stand, and I really like the old one, and I want to see it. I think you're right, Mark, that narrative is a way of us getting at something behind something real. And again, yeah, it's this, we're doing hard stuff here, but it's pleasing, and it's productive, and it's good. So keep at it. Okay, A. Adams Elias. Do you think there's a worship of history as a vehicle of canonizing a new set of heroes? History is a very funny word, because history, when we talk about that word, we talk about it as modernist. Think about that. You have Herodotus and his history, and Livy and his history. And there's always a vibrant debate about the Gospels, the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Are those history? And, you know, um, Tom Holland is working through his ideas. What's the Bible's relationship with history? This gets into that really knotty question about and his historicism, historiography, all of these things come together. What we're doing, why we're stumbling about these difficult things, is that the question is, how do we sum up the vastness of reality into logos? Because lately I've been talking about, I had to preach on John 1. The word becomes flesh. Well, what on earth? What is the relationship between flesh and word? What's the relationship between heaven and earth? And again, you notice all of these connections coming together. Well, history is an attempt to record what? And if you read good history, it's full of people, and we're looking at motivations. Well, motivations are always quietly behind our skulls. Well, how do we know what's motivating another person? We don't even know what's motivating ourselves. So why do we look at these patterns? And so I think a big issue in terms of the downfall of the Bible in the modernist fundamentalist fight had been, in some ways, a worship of a certain kind of history. I'm just noticing that a whole lot of people talking about these things were they're doing currently as going down in history. Yes. Before history is even a chance to happen. That's right. The arc of history, the right side of history. And what that betrays is sort of the modernist take on reality with a priority to physicality, but there's a cheat in there, because again, all of these physicalists, naturalists, materialists, atheists, in terms of their morality, are all preoccupied about suffering. Well, is suffering physical? Well, there are nerve endings, there's a biochemical level to it, but you're not really concerned about the physicality of suffering. You're concerned about suffering. Well, what is suffering? Well, if all of these ideas and experiences and emotions are simply the cruft of physicality, why do you care so much if people suffer? Yet you do. So yeah, this is just one of those nexuses. Is this just historionics? Or do you think people will try to gain power by rewriting big history? Oh, yes. That history has always now I sound like a postmodernist. History has always been a fight for power. Is the story of America a story about white supremacy? Well, sure it is. Is it a story about liberty? Well, sure it is. Is it a story about the destruction of Native Americans? Well, sure it is. Is it a story about religious people looking for a blank slate in order to construct the kingdom of God in New England towns? Well, sure it is. But now we have all these competing histories, and a hierarchy is going to develop. Well, it's more one than another. Well, that probably part of that's going to depend on whether you're a Puritan coming over with the Mayflower, whether you are a Virginian coming over and making a bundle growing tobacco, or if you're a Native American, or if you're an African coming over in the belly of a ship. So history is very modernistic because we are attempting a monarchical vision of the entire thing. But none of us can afford a monarchical vision. Only God can. And whether you want to put God in scare quotes or not, it still works the same. And that was a big part of Jordan Peterson's work. So yeah, big history is big power. And if you can, and the what's happening in America right now is a struggle for the history of the country, which is why statues were being torn down, because statues reflect the stories and the narratives behind them. And it's why, you know, walking away with Nancy Pelosi's podium is powerful in our nation. So, yeah. All right. Growing and learning together. I find a lot of people from the Peterson world. I find a lot of people from the Peterson world felonies, cultural Marxism, and postmodernism. And I have seen people describe the followers of these ideologies as evil or disgusting. That's how people talk when they don't like someone. Are they really? Sure, some of them are and some of them aren't. What do you make of all this? Is it warranted? I think our language is a commons and we ought to care for it. And so if you use a really big word like evil about someone, well, it should fit. So do you use the same word for, I don't know, a genocidal dictator who killed 30, 60, or 100 million people and your neighbor's dog that poos on your lawn? Does that word really cover both? My dog, that dog is evil because he keeps leaving his turds in my lawn. You want to use evil for that? And you're going to use it for Mao? Is Mao a dog who leaves turds in your lawn? So this is about the commons of language, and our language ought to be measured. And this gets into rhetoric. There are times when rhetoric is exasperating, but it ought to be measured. Now, just because someone says that a person is evil doesn't mean they are evil. And there's all this complexity within rhetoric, within speakers and listeners. So my admonition would be, find the right word for the right context and the right moment and the right audience. Anybody who is a practiced speaker knows that audience is crucial. And anyone who is trying to speak to an audience has an agenda for the lives of the people listening. And so choose the words that pursue the agenda, but also keep in mind to the commons. All right. Tristan, woo boy. Hey, Paul, greetings from Hamilton, Ontario. Courtesy of a cultural Christian turned Pentecostal Jesus freak somehow found himself a student in the Reformed Institute of Redeemer University. That's me. Hey, Redeemer University. I know that. A lot of good people there at Redeemer. I don't know how to ask this question without sounding like a butthurt traditionalist. But I suppose unfiltered is better than nothing at all. Sounds good to me. I like unfiltered. What is your advice on how one should relate or engage, I mean those separately, with one's ex-evangelical progressive church friends? I have so many friends who have gone the way of everything that you've said in your videos on that topic. Progressive revelation of modern moral superiority replaces an inspired scripture with a very human text, but the liturgist, science Mike Peter N says, the church is nasty and full of Trump supporters, so I'll be over there in my universalism because it feels good and I want to be on the right side of history. That's a pretty good summary. To put it bluntly, when does someone stop being my brother, sister in Christ? How can I tell the difference between variance within the body and a profound departure from the tradition? What does one do in light of that with those relationships? What a wretch I am. And a little Canadian flag. I love it. Great question. Okay, let's start with first things. First things first. Jesus commands us to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbor as ourself. And right there in that tension, you find yourself with your friends. I think, relate and engage lovingly on both counts. And here's the crazy thing about love. Love does not mean, remember, the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is apathy. Um, so I think, number one, maintain as much relational contact outside of this sphere of interest. Have common hobbies, have common interests, enjoy the same music, build community. Why is community important to the quest for truth? Because to a certain degree, productive disagreement can only happen if there's a platform of trust between the people. And this to me is part of what has been so special about the conversations in this little corner of the internet. You know, John Vervaeke knows what I am. He knows what I do for a living. I know John Vervaeke a little bit. I hope that um the meeting in I hope that at some point we meet in person. Maybe it'll be Thunder Bay, Ontario. I hope by September that vaccines and air travel and all of that can become sufficient for that. Um, but John is able to do these conversations because John trusts, and John is in control of himself. Now, there's the specific. It's far harder to deal with these kinds of things in contexts like that matter, like a family or a church. And that's why those kinds of conflicts are so difficult. And that's why church fights. I remember having a conversation with he was in the Minnesota state legislature, and he was also the president of his council. And I asked him, I said, describe, compare and contrast political fights and church fights. He says, "Oh, church fights are a lot worse." Why? Because via God and salvation and everything else, the voltage is so much higher because it means everything and it means everything always. And these are people that you have a high degree of commonality with. So you care about them. And so when things go bad, it really hurts. And that's why, in Washington, there need to be Republicans and Democrats going on fishing trips together and playing baseball together and having, sons and daughters marry each other and having shared grandchildren. And this is, and this is why if the only people that you will be friends with are those who share your political opinion, you are in a bad place. And if you are cutting people off on social media because they are loving Trump or hating Trump, you are going to have a problem. And this is part of what is challenging America right now. And again, Brett Sockold and I talked about this on our Monday thing that I'll post on Monday. And it is exactly what Jordan Peterson said on the Bill Maher show. Okay, maybe you think half the country are idiots and assholes. What are you going to do about it? Kill them? Put them in concentration camps? Exile them? You want a civil war? Dial it back. Find commonality. Create a space in which you can have a productive argument and disagreement, but keep loving them. Because the command of Christ is to love your neighbor all the way up to and including your enemy. And often the biggest enemies are the one that you share a home with, or maybe even a bed with. That's the way reality lays itself out. Why do you think divorces are so painful? Why do you think when a woman shows up dead, the first person the cops think about is her husband, who he shared a stage with and pledged undying love. That's how this stuff works. So keep your ties and relationships with the people you disagree with and be patient. Because you know what? Everybody's all in a tizzy about what happened just not too long ago. And that can be about the specific things that happened last week in America, or it can be, if you listen to this a year from now, the things that happened a week or a month ago when you're listening to this. That's how we work. So be patient, love your enemies, and especially love your enemies who are your friends, and especially love the enemies that are within your church. And when and where do you draw a line? For the most part, we as individuals don't need to draw that line. And so take up the monastic the monastic pledge of staying. So is your church going off the rails? Stay with it. People want to jump ship. Oh, okay. So what does that do for the other people in the church that are not jumping ship? Cutting and running, sometimes there's a time for it, but don't do that quickly or lightly or easily. That should be a last resort. Stay in there, stay in the fight, be a pain in the neck minority. And that gets into the question of the union of the body of Christ. Um, yeah, that's a great question. It's a question where a lot of people are at. See, how am I doing? How am I doing? Shosh Jules. I'm gonna keep at this. I may go a little over time. Rick was like, well, maybe we should do a 3-hour one. It's like, all right. Okay. Building off the previous question and answer. Is it because we see the world through projections that we see the Father through his image and would be annihilated if we were to see him without the mediation of his image? Ooh, that's a good question. That's a good thought. Yeah, I think there's something to that. That's really good. That's really good. I really like that. I think there's something to that because, when I was a kid, you'd always, it's in the Bible all over the place. Well, you can't see God and live. Well, what does that mean? Well, what is idolatry? Idolatry is in some ways not seeing God because we're seeing our own avarice. We can't see through our own desires and temptations to actually see God. And what that means is that we create a ring like Sauron's ring, and we create something in order to try to wield the world through God. And when people do that to us, we find it enormously offensive. And that seems to be how God finds it. So that's a great thought, Matthew. That one's gonna live in my head. And if you see it coming out in monologue videos, you colonized me. So gold star for colonizing. All right, Jason again, Almond Tree. Hey, Paul, I live in Tennessee. So maybe it's something to do with the area I live in, but does there seem to be a larger or more national concern with the way that politics has entered into the church? I don't know if in my lifetime that hasn't been a concern. Does it rise and fall? I'm sure it does. But again, we probably see it depending on where we're standing and what's going on. Martin Luther King Jr. in the 1950s and 60s said Sunday morning is the most segregated time in America. That isn't just true in terms of skin color. Just recently, I was feeling kind of down, and someone told me to go listen to some good teaching. But then I realized that I don't even know who to listen to and where to find good, solid Christian teaching anymore because of the way that politics is seeped in with the teaching. Even if they aren't talking about, then read old books because there'll probably be politics in it, but it won't be germane to you. Read old sermons. And, if you read history next to it, you'll see that, well, there's probably some politics going on there too. So I would say do a time shift, and that might help you. And again, this is where C.S. Lewis was so helpful. We live in the tyranny of the moment. Well, how can you break that tyranny? Read old books, because they're not in the tyranny of the moment. And one of the ways that our times are tyrannical is because certain elements of the population don't want you to read old books. Well, why not? Well, because they're tyrants. They want you to again, read C.S. Lewis's Screw Tape Letters. God wants his children to become sons. The devil wants us to become food. That's what tyranny is. I'm going to colonize you and use you and spit you out when I'm done with you. No, read old books. You'll find good Christian teaching in old books, and you'll gain perspective on what is always true, because they'll have their own warp back in their day too, but at least it's not the same warps you're looking at today. Even if they aren't talking about politics, I feel like something seeps in along the way. Yep. To me, it's poison. Yep. 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 Read old books. That's my answer. I'm trying to be fast here. All right. Grim Grizz. Ooh, we're into the present. We're into today. Whoa. Yeah, I might exhaust them today. I'm excited. That Grimline Hardline video was really good. You started speaking at the end about missionary whatnot. I come from a digital land of false realities. Yes, indeed. Would you consider assembling a Bridges of Meaning Overwatch League? Esport money, Blizzard Entertainment is Overwatch, I think, is a game. I'm an old man. I don't know the thing that them young kids are doing out there on the interwebs. And prototype a missionary team to reach the Utes from the digital realities with sub divine creators. Do you have that sweet missionary skills safe enough to teach the pub? Do you have sweet missionary skills safe enough to teach the public? Any nunchuck skills if things get dicey? Great question. My conversation with Grim Grizz, it was such a great conversation. Is such a cool guy. I hope Jacob's always telling me I got to make disciples. That's a true thing. I hope what I'm doing is making disciples, but I don't. The world is too big, and so some people are going to need to take a little bit of what they've learned from me and do a new thing that I can never do. That's how the kingdom of God works. That's how the church works. That's how mission works. I can do things that Jordan Peterson can't do. Jordan Peterson can do things that I can't do. I can do things that Luke can do. Luke can do things that I can't do. And round and round and round and round. And that's why the body, that's why God works with us in such different ways. And yeah. And the thing is, we will all, if we care, we will all be missionaries of one sort or another. And yeah. So missionary skills. Hey, Paul, I'm a Jewish follower of Jesus. Hey, we got to Shosh Jules. I've been listening to your podcast. So interesting that multi-generational Christians lose faith. Yeah. And yet I was first generation believer in my family. Congratulations. Who came to believe in 1980 at the age of 26. Continue to find more reason to believe as the years pass. Amen. I have 2 adult children. One is a follower and one leans towards the new atheists. Our son has now said, I begged God to reveal himself to me in a real way when I was in high school and he didn't show up. I gave him 17 years now. I'm done. So what do you think this is? Predestination? None of us have access to the book of life. So I am a Calvinist, and so I have a vigorous view of predestination, but none of us know. And so I think Neil Punt, who wrote a couple of books, he was a CRC preacher, wrote a couple of books called Biblical Universalism, basically said, we presume everyone is saved unless we know differently. I think that's a pretty good way to look at it. And I remember my father talking to my father about Neil Punt's book, and my father says, I think practically that's how we all have to look at it. And I think my father was right. We are such time-bound creatures, and we live in the moment. And it was so much fun last week. So, a friend of mine walked into church right before the sermon and sat down from the sermon and listened to the whole sermon. And afterwards, we talked about the sermon. And according to a mutual, someone who knows both of us, he says this guy, you never would have imagined that 10 years ago from this guy. What changed in him? Well, Jordan Peterson. You listen to Jordan Peterson. And then Sunday, when we were talking, he was laying out for me a very Petersonian idea of what religion is. Now, he doesn't believe in God, and he, doesn't know the Bible, and he still thinks religion is, well, he doesn't think religion is hogwash anymore. Now religion is sociology. And that's why in my Rationality Rules video, my last one, I said, he's making his way, because we're all young and stupid. Everyone has a right to be that. And then in time, we learn and change and grow. Now, this question about God's hiddenness, that's going to be in my sermon this week, because there's the funny thing about this, that the answer about God's hiddenness in the Bible is really complex. Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. Paul in Acts 17, and God is, the knowledge of God is plain. And if you look at almost all of human history, almost every people in the world had some conception of God, right or wrong, bent or twisted, but one way or another, it was out there. The Bible acknowledges that. There's sort of a common tongue that we use when we use this word God. And about 500 years ago, we entered sort of a dark age, which we call the Enlightenment, where we think we know so much, but the one thing we don't know is everything. And, that sounds pantheistic, but I'm not a pantheist. I mean, Lewis was right that pantheism is sort of default religion in the world. So your son's working his way on his stuff. Let him work. Let him, don't trust God. Don't be anxious, because, and I have loved ones of mine that have rejected the faith. And so I know that pain. But we have the kind of God that would seek us at the cost of his son. And the closeness of the Father and the Son is closer than a mother and a son by virtue of the Trinity. If Christianity is true, then God is so good, he will work things out that are right. Now, some of the universalists just jumped up and down and said, woohoo, that's right. Okay. And maybe they're right. I'm not a universalist. Others will hear that and know that there are mortal enemies who deserve judgment in the age to come and say, that's right. I can't answer that question for other people or convince them one way or another.
Those are quiet.
But I can say that a God who would do what he did for us can be trusted. And that's the foundation. That's the foundation. So, no, I wouldn't say, oh no, he's reprobate. No. Because the Apostle Paul was hunting down followers of the way, and Jesus says, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And blinds him. And then sends him to Ananias, and Ananias is like, I don't want to meet this guy. He's hunting us down. God says, you go there. God, for his hardest work, is hardest on some of his most stubborn tools. God is God and we are not, but he can be trusted. And that's at the heart of the Christian faith. And God will test our faith. And God will test our faith beyond what we think is reasonable, or perhaps even what we think is loving of him. And so I don't have any, when people come to me and they are angry with God and they are unbelieving, I have sympathy. Because look, the center of our faith is the Son of God on a Roman cross crying, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's at the center of our faith. And so, the Chesterton quote that Zizek found impressive and Jordan Peterson found impressive as well, there's a reason we find it impressive, because it's audacious and it's true. And, as Jordan Peterson keeps saying, it's archetypal. You can't get around it. That's right. So love your son. Love your son. And if he's far from God and his church at the moment, just pray for him more. But don't be anxious, because our God is a good God and he loves you and your son more than you can love your son. So trust in him. Trust in him, and let that trust be your foundation. So, all right. Sorry, I'm not getting a lot of voice chat questions in this time because, Rick and Joey want me to finish up the question. So I'm going to do it. I'm going to stay on it a little so I can get them through. All right. Okay. ABJ Allen, I was reading Psalm this week, numbers 1 through 10 so far. I'm astounded at how much more relevant these feel since the political chaos erupted in DC lately. Comments? Yes. Read David's life. Think about the times David lives in. So Israel is being mauled in their own land by the Philistines. If you have any idea how hard life was in the Iron Age, so there's two ways to live. You can grow your own food, or you can be a bully and wait till your neighbor grows it and steals it. But don't steal so much food that they die of starvation, because then you're not going to be able to play the same trick next year. That's what the Philistines are doing to the Israelites. And they've got a corner on ironworking. And so Israel is in a terrible mess. And, not only are they stealing their food, they're stealing their daughters, they're killing their sons. I mean, it's a brutal and barbaric age. And so Israel's like, we need a king. Well, why do you need a king? Because we got to deal with the Philistines. And so, read Samuel 8. And then, okay, what kind of king do we need? We need a big king. We need a strong, good-looking, strapping guy. We need a Rottweiler. And Saul, oh, look at him. He's big, he's strong. He's hiding among the baggage. That should give you an idea that you might have one of these big fat American Rottweilers that won't bite. They're kind of big teddy bears because they've been bred to be good-natured. I remember when I bought my 2 Rottweilers, I bought it from a woman who was a cop, and she raised police dogs, and she said, these dogs will bite. And my dogs never did. They're joyful dogs. My little dog bites. But anyway, so they get Saul. And as is the case often, Saul becomes a tyrant, that he's not quite able to take out the Philistines, but he does prey on his own sheep. And so poor Samuel gets to trot off to Jesse. Jesse's got a lot of good-looking sons and goes through you got any more? God says no. Well, yeah, we got that one out in the field. We'll call him in. I'll anoint this one, David. And, David brings his lunch to his brothers who are at the front. And Goliath is, being a troll in many ways, calling down, and David, plucky kid. How dare he talk about God that way? And Saul, the coward, says, well, why don't you wear my armor and go out there? Yeah, you big coward. You're the giant of Israel. But David goes out there and, of course, slays the giant. And, well, now David's a celebrity. And now Saul's, being a weenie. And, on and 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 on. That's the environment. And then, David, now he's running from Saul, has 2 opportunities to kill Saul. And he goes and he lives with the Philistines and does raiding parties with the Philistines, lying to them so that the Philistines think that he's raiding on Judah, but David's just really raiding on Judah's enemies. And then he gets stuck, and the rest of the Philistines are like, I bet you he's, they probably knew he wasn't raiding on Israel. So they've got competition amongst themselves. And so then he gets into a place where now he's going to have to go out at the head of, just read those stories in the book of Samuel. They're astounding. And the fact that Hollywood can't do a credible job with them is it speaks of the poverty of Hollywood. And so, yeah, reading Psalms 1 through 10 in the middle of a little bit of political tremor in America, if America loses its cohesion in the next few months and years and becomes politically unstable, which very well may happen, it happens. This is the age of decay. It happens to all empires. If we say the British Empire today, we sort of laugh. What empire do they have? Well, they're having trouble keeping Scotland right now. Sorry, I don't mean any disrespect to you Brits over there, but it's the way empire goes. Life is hard and brutal, and I have I was born in the early 60s. I've lived in the most peaceful, magical time in America. I am so fortunate. Might we be heading for rough waters? Absolutely. One of my favorite Frank Capra movies is Meet John Doe. Watch that movie and get a sense of the political anxiety that there was in America in the 1930s. FDR is having term after term. Is FDR going to become a dictator? And then the Second World War. The world is rough. Always has been. It always will be. So, yeah, I totally get that. Read the Psalms and it's like, wow. Yeah. And before, when the power was on and the grocery stores were full, and one president nicely concedes to the next, and elections aren't contested, and Russians or Chinese or COVID or yeah, people are going to be reading the Bible with whole new eyes. All right. Luke Cooper, what do you think is coming to an end in North America? I don't know. Any thoughts on the characteristics of what might emerge? This is the age of decay, baby. Everything we build breaks down. And but it's always hard to tell. I'm old enough to remember the 70s. I was in high school in the 70s. There was bombings, the Weather Underground. That's just a nice website to find a weather at. That's a joke. The Weather Underground, they were bombing places. Look at the history of Alcatraz. A group took up occupation of Alcatraz Island and had it for a while, and the feds just kind of shrugged their shoulders for a while until they had to, clamp down on them. Part of the problem of Americans has always been we don't read much history. Look at America in the 19th century. Look at what elections were like in America in the 19th century. Free and fair election. Look at the election of John F. Kennedy and some of the shenanigans that went on in Texas. Yeah, we'll see. I don't know. All right, last question for today. I'm going to mark it so that I can remember. No sneaking new. Well, maybe I'll take a question or two from the room just because I've shut all you guys up. I watched your talk with Vervaeke and Mary Cohen. I watched the talk. You, Vervaeke, and Mary Cohen were we're talking about narrative, and John Vervaeke mentioned needing to get beyond the narrative and to the notion of trans-narrative. Well, that's sort of, I don't mean this disrespectfully, that's sort of John's shtick. It's the transjective, and he's right, because, and it's sort of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. I mean, again, we've been talking about 1, 2, and then 3. There's a reason these things sort of relate that way. I thought about how much religion is based upon narrative, as well as how my personal identity is based on narrative. Yeah, that's your soul. It's your soul is kind of like narrative, but it's a not a narrative you're in charge of, and it's constructed, and that's reality. Um, Even how our cultural narrative and values are expressed through art and movies and express a narrative. That's right. Uh, we what is a principality? What are these principalities and powers? Are they emanating from above? Yeah, they live in the heavenlies. You got to think that one all the way through. And we're participating in them, not just following them, but also creating them. Postmodernism speaks of deconstructing the narrative. Is narrative the air we breathe? Well, narrative, and again, John and I talked about this fairly early on, and he made a point which I think he's right. It takes us a while as human beings to get up to speed on this capacity for narrative. And it seems deeply connected with our capacity for personal memory, and also related to identity. So when you're saying, is narrative the air we breathe? Narrative is yeah, it's a really big deal, and it's all around us. But it's is air the right is air the right metaphor for that? I don't know. It seems more like a deep coding. But then, Mark asked, what's the relationship between narrative and story? Is there a thing behind the narrative that narrative is trying to model or represent, or but then we take that and we run on it. So yeah. It's really hard. What is your take on narrative? That's still under construction. And like I said, I'm going to talk to Mark this week, and I'll probably learn something there. I'm reading Stephen King's On Writing. I'm hoping to learn something there. As you know, a lot of what I talked about today in terms of the soul, this is something I was thinking a lot about a number of years ago. And when I was getting more, I was more serious about trying to write a book then than I had been before, and probably have been since, because there's something about this relationality and soul, that soul is I use story because starts with S, just like soul. Soul is more like a story than it is like a substance. Okay. And that word substance, I had to send a thank you note to Strawn, and now some of you know who he is. He hasn't been on my channel yet. I'm still waiting for the debut of Strawn on my channel, but because when you get, I'm having issues with the conceptualization of substance, and there's an old fight in theology between substance and energies, and again, some of this has come to us via orthodoxy, and part of the blessing of the revival of orthodoxy in North America is that some of these ancient ideas are now on the menu for Western theologians. And so when someone like Nathan Jacobs goes to my alma mater and goes to orthodoxy, well, I pay attention to that, because you know he's a good faith guy and he's a smart guy and he's seeing things. So what about me? Am I going to see it? Am I going to become orthodox? Am I going to let my beard grow? Am I going to start dressing in robes? How's it going to end? Who can tell? I kind of doubt it. I'm getting up there in age, and always the big transition for preachers is when they retire, what will they do? Because preachers, when they are constrained by their employment and their church. They stay sort of in one thing, but and then when they retire, what do they become? Liberals? To become heretics? Do they? My father certainly didn't. My father continued to be who he was, and I suspect I probably will be too. I will stay a Dutch Calvinist, and I don't think I'll become Roman Catholic. I don't become Orthodox. But boy, talking to Brett Sockold, brother from another ecclesiastical mother, sure enjoyed that. So yeah. What is the story of Paul Vanderklay and how will it end? I just this morning wrote out a PowerPoint for um I wrote out a PowerPoint for a video that if I have time this afternoon, maybe I'll make on, just I was just going through the Jordan Peterson timeline, and it's it part that someday someone's going to write a really good biography of Jordan Peterson because he has led an interesting life, and I hope there are biographers out there right now that are keeping notes and finding sources. But in many ways, you can't write a good biography about someone while they're still living. And if you read enough biographies, you begin to notice that a biography of Abraham Lincoln now is different from a biography of Abraham Lincoln written in the 1870s. So reality is like that. So there we have come to the end of all of the written questions. Joey and Rick can now lay their heads on their pillows tonight in total satisfaction and blissful slumber because now the backlog is relieved and we haven't gone tremendously over time. But if there's a question or two from the voice chat that someone just has to get in there, here's your chance.
Sam wanted to ask, isn't the important thing about the Abrahamic God that he is both Arenic and agentic?
Yes.
So doesn't that kind of get split up by C.S. Lewis with Aslan and Aslan's father, one being Arenic, one being agentic, and them being kind of, two as opposed to one?
Yes. Points scored for Sam, which is why we love him. Yeah. I mean, this stuff is really hard. I mean, all this, I'll throw Luke at this. That there are, all models fall short, but models are necessary. And Luke can say it better. I don't know if he's still busy or even in the room, but that's Luke's great quote, and it's a great quote. So so you can always just fall back on the fact that how can our little brains comprehend the maker of the universe? How can they comprehend the universe? I mean, that's what we're trying to do. Whether we're trying to satisfy some desire or whether we're trying to figure out what a good life is. And it's weird because even we as human beings, a parent in a household is Arenic. And you get that sense if you again read Greenlight's Matthew McConaughey's his father was Arenic in his life. And yet his father was also agentic. So these are some of these dualities that we split, and we have to split them because we learn things when we split them. Dualities are helpful. They teach us things. So yeah, there is some of that duality. I mean, C.S. Lewis is a really cool guy. Got some stuff wrong. Was not a perfect man, but we praise God for what he was able to do. So, good question. Anybody else before we wrap it up? Before we end transmission on this Truman Show. All right, Rick. I can't see Rick's camera. Rick had to turn off his camera. We're having bandwidth issues on the Living Stones network. Rick, I can't see you. You gonna turn that back on? Or maybe it's something has just crashed. Today's cardboard day. After this meeting, Rick and I are going to get rid of a bunch of cardboard around. Oh, there's Rick. He's live again. Are we ready to end transmission, Rick? Just about. Okay, so let me thank all of you in the Bridges of Meaning voice chat. Rick found this funky little graphic that you can see on the YouTube. I guess last week a bunch of you said, "Oh, let's like the video, push Paul up the video up the algorithm," and it did. If you like the video, I guess we get more stuff. I guess that's why all the YouTubers that I watch who have big channels like and subscribe and hit the notification bell. But I just feel so mercenary. But thank you all for joining me. This is so much fun for me, and you are such a gracious audience. And I hope something that I have said has been helpful. And now that we've gotten through all the questions, hopefully, maybe next week, if you ask a question, I'll get to it the same week. And if we don't have so many questions next week, maybe we'll take more from the floor. So we'll see how it goes. Thanks for watching. Thanks for visiting. And may the grace of God be with you. That sounds like a very ministerial thing to say. All right, Rick, you can end transmission.